Good morning. This is Peter Pulsfer. Can you hear me?
Good morning, Peter. It's Andrei. I'm hear you very well.
Excellent. Well, where are you based, Andre?
I'm based in Akureyri, Iceland.
Okay. Good morning to you then.
I guess for you it's good evening.
No, I'm in Ottawa, Canada, so it's about 3:45 in the morning.
Good morning to you too.
Thank you. And I see we have Carlos.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, I'm just going to do some testing, make sure my screen sharing is working okay.
All right. Yes, I see a screen.
Okay, I was trying to just share my PowerPoint, so I'll try that again. Share Microsoft PowerPoint.
Yes, I see your presentation.
Okay, and then I'll just put it into presenter mode.
Yes, it works well.
Okay.
Yeah, I see all slides.
Okay, just gonna make sure it goes through okay. Stop share. And then I'll try my video here and see if that works.
Yeah, I see you very well.
Okay, great. I'm just gonna stop that for a moment. Realize I need my glasses. I'm just gonna step away for a second.
Yeah. Yes, I see a video.
Okay, great. I see Shannon coming on, I think.
Unfortunately, I can't share my video since my camera doesn't work on my working computer.
Yeah, no worries. I think we'll have most people probably will not, but I thought as presenter, I'll do that. Just gonna adjust some of my background here just a moment. Okay. Okay, then I think I'll go back to screen share. So I'm just going to close a few windows here to make life easier. Okay.
Peter, I'm just double checking. I'm in the reporting document. That's where I'm supposed to record, yes?
Yes, that's the Google Doc.
Yes.
Good morning, by the way. Very early
Yes,
morning
good
for you.
morning.
Good
You know,
morning.
surprisingly, my daughter was up. I was like, go back to bed.
Yeah, I should say good night to you, actually. It's not really. I know it's morning officially, but
Yeah, it's about 1:45 here.
yeah. Sorry, I'm just going to have a brief snack and open my tea.
Good plan.
Shut my video off for that. Okay, now we'll see if anyone attends. Shannon, just in case we need it, could I ask that you test your screen share? I'll take mine off, and I just want to see if, while we're in discussion, taking notes, if we need to have you have the document up. Good morning, Jonathan. Can you hear me, Shannon?
Hi.
Good morning or afternoon.
I was a bit confused. I went to the wrong meeting room.
Okay, no
I
worries.
should be helping with the chat. So
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
can I just ask a question?
Sure.
Do I just contact you privately to tell you, or do I just put it in the general notes? How do we best tell you?
I would say depends. I will try to monitor the chat.
Mm-hmm.
And so if there's anything, you could just do it privately and say, Peter, take note of this or that.
Okay.
But also it can be helpful if you just jump in verbally.
Okay, great.
So when we go to sort of the questions and answers, I can't remember if you were on the email that I had sent, but
Yeah.
yeah, okay. So
I
when
only
we
just
go
read
to,
it, I'm sorry.
yeah, that's okay. No worries at all. When we go to questions and answers, I would just ask you to, as much as you can, keep track. We'll ask people to use the raise hand function.
Great.
And then we can go through there. And then, I think it'll depend on how many people we have, but it will, we'll sort of manage from there once I have a sense of the number of participants.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, Peter, I'd had to step away for a second. Did you want me to talk?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to see if you could test your screen share. Just in case
Sure.
when we're in discussions, we want to bring up the document and have people sort of see it while we're discussing.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Oh, that's strange. Let me look.
It's almost too early in the morning. I don't know what time it is where you are.
What time is it for you?
It's just 8 o'clock in the morning. I'm in Iceland, so it's not so bad.
Oh,
Okay.
it's just 9 in the morning for me, but I like to sleep.
It looks dark wherever you are, Peter.
Yeah, it's 4 in the morning here. Yeah, and
Wow.
it's two in the morning for Shannon. So we'll give her the award so far.
So you'll be really sharp today. So.
Oh yeah. I don't know, by hour 3, we might have some issues.
Peter said,
could we have a coffee break in the middle just to go and grab a coffee and go to the loo or something?
Yes. Jan Rene Larson said he was coming to this session because he heard it had the best coffee. So
amazing.
Sorry,
He's not
Tom.
wrong. We do have great coffee.
Okay, I just swapped my computer. Sorry, I just swapped my computer because it's easier for me.
Okay. We are getting an echo now though, so I don't know. It looks like you may have 2 microphones on.
I'm done now.
Okay, great.
Yeah, brilliant.
Okay, welcome all. We're going to get started in a few minutes, if you just bear with us. Shannon, were you able to test your screen share?
It's not working particularly well for some reason.
Okay, well, what I can do is I can screen share it. Good morning, Allison.
Good morning.
Apologies, Peter. I don't
Yeah,
know
no
why,
worries.
but
Okay,
it's
so
not working.
I will just keep mine up then, and and when need be, I can share it. But if you're writing, it'll be in real time. So
Yes, I can see it coming up on, I've got two computers going, so.
okay, so if you all bear with me, I'll get back to my screen share here.
Peter, do you want me to record the participants?
Yeah, and actually, if we have a reasonable number, I'll ask people to introduce themselves, just so we have a sense of affiliations and so on.
Okay.
Okay, can you see my screen now, the agenda?
Yes.
Yeah, no
Okay,
problem.
excellent, great, thank you. Okay, and we'll give it till maybe about 2 minutes after the hour, just to give people a chance to log on if they're installing Zoom and so on.
I have someone on screen listed as TT. Could I get your name, please?
Oh yeah, sorry, that's my name. I'm Tom Barry.
Barry, thank you.
Barry, yeah, at the CAF, the Arctic Council.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, and we'll give it 1 more minute, and then we can get started. We've got a reasonable number of people for this early session, so I'll maybe we can go around and do introductions.
And Kate, can I get your last name, please?
Hi there, Kate here. It's Nimantinga. Do I need to spell it for you?
That would be lovely.
Niemamantinga.
Lovely, thank you so much.
Okay, we still have a few people joining, so I'm just going to give it another couple of minutes. Okay, welcome to those who are just joining. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes for people to come on.
I think I've got everybody, Peter, but this participant list does not come up in any kind of order. It's super fun.
Yeah, it's interesting that way. So we'll give it just 1 more minute, and then I think we'll get started.
Yeah, based on number count, I do have everyone. Okay, good.
Okay. Okay, well, I think I will get started. My name is Peter Pulsifer. I'm the lead for Working Group 4. I'll be working with Shannon Christofferson, who's also online. Shannon will be rapporteur, but also has been at this with us for a long time. And so we'll be co-facilitating at times as well as needed. You'll see on your screen, we have an agenda for the working sessions that are part of Arctic Observing Summit. And so first of all, thank you all for joining at very odd hours for many of you. I know it's very late, very early. I appreciate you taking the time. So we have a number of sessions scheduled. This is session 1. And in this, it's listed as an introductory and then moving into discussion, as well as we have some introductory presentations. For example, Sandy Starkweather will join us at about 10 o'clock GMT. She's jumping from session to session to talk about the SEON road mapping process with roads, but she'll join us in a couple of hours to present on that. Each of the other sessions, session 2, 3, and 4 in particular, do have particular themes assigned to them, but as indicated in the agenda, we don't necessarily need to stick to this. So during the discussion, if you want to jump in and talk about, federated search or semantics or community building or whatever, feel free to do so. We recognize that you may or may not be able to join all of the sessions, and probably likely not. So if you have ideas on any of the others, feel free to jump in. And similarly, in sessions 2, 3, and 4, we will probably have some level of introductory and recordings and things like that, or at least we can refer people to recordings, but we may go over things as well. Sessions 5 and 6, which are tomorrow and Thursday, will be focused more on writing. So if you're interested in helping out with that and having a hand in the initial statement that we're drafting, you can join then, although again, it's not ideal in terms of timing, at least tomorrow evening. I will ask Shannon, while I think about it, tomorrow evening I may need you to get started with that session. I have a PhD defense I'm sitting in that may go over time, and if it does, I'll have a bit of a conflict. So,
Yeah, that's fine, Peter.
okay, so before we get started on anything more formal, we have a reasonable number of people online, so I do want people to introduce themselves. And maybe Shannon, if you could just call out people by the names that you have registered. And if I could just ask you for your name, of course, but also your affiliation, and just maybe a few sentences just about your interests or background and the reason for your joining us.
Well, the first one on my screen is me, so I guess I'll start with me.
Okay.
I'm Shannon Christofferson. I am the data manager at the Arctic Institute of North America. I'm also a technical team lead for the Canadian Consortium for Arctic Data Interoperability. And I am also on the Semantics Working Group of the Arctic Data Committee. And semantics is one of my big interests in this particular field. Next on my screen is Andre, but he is our host. I don't know if he's participating.
Yes, thank you, but I'm just a technician, so welcome everybody.
Okay, Peter, you've introduced yourself. Allison?
Hello, everyone. I'm Allison Gaylord with Nuna Technologies. I'm based in Homer, Alaska. I'm part of the Arctic Research Mapping Application and the Arctic Observing Viewer development team. I've been participating in the Polar Semantics Working Group. I'm very interested in the polar interoperability for polar observing assets, and that's why I'm here. Very tired.
Yeah, same. Let's see, next we have Bridget. Oh, Brigitte, I'm sorry.
I should say to say. I am new in the Arctic scientific community, so I've been working on the Arctic for a few months. I'm from the Joint Research Center of the European Commission in Italy, and I've been asked to look at the potential of GRC's datasets and methods for the monitoring of the Arctic, but with the final aim in mind to try to define a set of resilience indicators. And where possible, using a social, economical, ecological approach. Thank you.
Now I see Darius.
Yes, good morning from Longyearbyen and Svalbard. I'm Dariusz Ignatuk from SIOS, Svalbard Integrated Arctic Observing System. I'm working with Øystein Godoy from Norwegian Institute of Meteorology. I'm mostly dealing with the engagement of our consortiums with our partners from the international institutions. I'm also working on metadata and collecting. Thank you.
Thank you. Emmanuel Pica.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Emanuele Pica, a young researcher at INGB, Istituto Nazionale di Geofisica e Vulcanologia from Italy. I'm involved in data science and data management for the upper physics group at INGB, and we have also instrument in Arctic region and Antarctic region, and I'm involved in all field related to the data interoperability and data stewardship. So thank you for this time.
Eric Book.
Yeah, hello, my name is Eric Book. I'm a private consultant, primarily working for Eurogoose, and via that I'm engaged in a number of projects focusing on the Arctic, primarily Copernicus program, in situ program, and the Antares project. Thank you.
Erin McLean.
Good morning from California. My name is Erin McLean, and I work in community engagement and outreach for the Arctic Data Center.
Honigstein. Did I say that incorrectly? Henrik Steen Anderson?
Hello, did you mean Jennifer Austin? Hi.
You can speak, Jennifer. I was looking for Henrik Steen.
Oh, okay.
But I don't see her.
I'm here. Good morning.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah, good morning, good evening. My name is Henrik Steen Andersen. I'm from the European Environment Agency. I'm here because I took the opportunity to collect information from the different entities in the Copernicus program. And that's why we have presented this white paper. So I'm mostly involved in coordinating what we call the Copernicus in situ component.
Thank you. Now I have you, Jennifer.
Hi, I'm helping with the chat monitoring. So if you've got any questions. So my background, I did environmental pollution at Lancaster. I'm not actively researching, but I'm just volunteering and helping and just finding out what exciting work you guys are doing.
Excellent. After Jennifer, I have Jonathan Blythe.
Hi, my name's Jonathan Blythe. I work for the United States government in the Department of the Interior. I work with data policy, and most of the time I'm working in the environmental studies program. That's part of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And obviously we have interests in the Arctic, in the Alaska region, but we're active all across the outer continental shelf. Thank you.
Kate?
Hi, I'm Kate Nimatenga. I'm the data manager at the South African National Space Agency. Just looking to get some information on data interoperability. Thanks.
Logan?
Hi, I'm Logan Rudkovich. I work for the Government of the Northwest Territories as their Climate Change Information Management Specialist, and I'm currently working on a metadata catalog for them.
Matt Jones?
Hi, I'm Matt Jones. I'm the Director of Informatics at NCEAS, the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis in California, and I direct the Arctic Data Center. I work with Erin, who already introduced herself. I'm also the Director of the Data One program, which is a large multinational federation of data repositories trying to focus on interoperability and compatibility of data for Earth and environmental sciences. Thanks.
Pierluigi?
You may be muted, Pierre.
There we go. Maybe not.
Do we want to come back to Pierre?
Yeah, it looks like he's left the meeting to start. He might have had to fix
Step away.
something.
Yep.
Ruth, can you go?
Sure. Ruth Dewar with the Ronan Institute for Independent Scholarship. Believe it or not, I've been working on federated searches since the early 90s and am a data manager.
Taco? All right, go ahead, Pierluigi.
Sorry about that. Hi,
No worries.
I'm Pierluigi Buttigieg. I'm a senior data scientist at the Alfred Wegener Institute. I also co-chair the Earth Science Information Partners Semantic Technologies Committee, working primarily on Earth and space semantics, and also on the operations committee of the Biological and Biomedical Ontologies Foundry. So lots of mixes in this regard, and working at the AVI, of course, more interest in the polar semantics scene these days, and I work with the Polar Semantics Working Group with quite a number of you that are present.
Thank you, Pierluigi.
Also, sorry, I have to plug also the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals ontology and semantic framework that's emerging. I collaborate with UNESCO, IOC, and also UN Environment.
Taco?
Yeah, now it works. Taco de Bruin. I'm a data manager at the Royal Netherlands Institute for Sea Research for both oceanographic data as well as polar data for the National Polar Program. I'm a member of the SUS Data Management Group and co-chairing the International Oceanographic Data and Information Exchange Committee of IOC UNESCO.
Toro?
Good morning. I work for the Nansen Environmental and Remote Sensing Center in Bergen, Norway. I work with data management in the Intaros project and also in several Norwegian research infrastructure and research projects. So I'm interested to learn more about federated search and to experience the online version of AOS.
Tom?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tom Barry, and I work within CAF, or the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna, which is the biodiversity working group within the Arctic Council. And CAF has responsibility for managing the Council's biodiversity monitoring and assessment programs and delivering the information that we generate through that work via what's known as the Arctic Biodiversity Data Service.
Excellent. We have one more person that seems to be popping in and out and is having difficulty, but they are not on at the moment, so.
Okay, we can come back to that and bring that person in when you next see them. Perhaps just send a chat and we can go from there.
Peter, if I may, I mean, I cannot see the screen is not moving, so I cannot see the if the agenda is up, I cannot see it. I don't know if that's true for everybody, but just to let you know.
Okay. Shannon, can you see the screen?
I see Arctic Observing Summit 2020 program.
A document, do you see it moving at the moment?
Nope.
Okay. Thank you.
I think
for
it's just the website.
Okay.
In the meantime, Peter, while you work on that, Carlos Pina Estani has joined.
Yes. Hello. Good morning.
Can you give a little bit of information on your affiliation, please?
Yeah, of course. I work for the Swiss Pole Institute, and I came here to see what's next and what's happening. I was in Helsinki in the federated search workshop, so haven't been following up much since then, but I want to know a bit more. And I'm not sure if I'm in the good meeting now or not.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Peter, you can see the screen now.
Okay, great. Thanks for letting me know, Henrik. So great. Well, welcome to all. I think I know many of you, but not all of you. And for those of you I don't, I'm glad you could join us. And for those of you who have been working at this for a while, thanks for coming back. So in this session, it is an introductory session. So we're going to have a few presentations, and we'll try not to spend too long on that, but I am going to give a bit of an introductory presentation. To start, there is a recording of a variation of that presentation on the website now, but I'm going to elaborate a little bit on some of the key things that I think we need to work on in the coming few days. And then we'll have Henrik as well as Tom in this session present to us. I apologize, in the agenda there's a duplicate of Anderson. Bill Manley will be presenting in a future session, I believe in session 2. And then a couple of others are not able to present, but I'll provide a brief summary in my presentation of their papers. And then I mentioned that at 10 o'clock GMT, Sandy Starkweather will come and present on roads, but we should have some time for some discussion before that. And I will leave it to the group to really guide the discussion. So we do have a couple of things that I do want to talk about specifically, so a review of some relevant global initiatives. But if most people on this call want to be talking about federated search, semantics, and so on, we can jump into that during the discussion. So before I get started with the presentation, I just want to see if there are any questions, comments, suggestions, etc.
Peter, just a point. In terms of level, are we looking at a high level, low level, technical, policy? Where are we going?
It really depends on who we have in the room, but I think when we're talking about technology, I think many of the people that we seem to have online could go into the lower levels. My presentation will be fairly high level because we're talking about higher level topics. I'm just trying to give an overview of things like what's happening, the activities going on, and so on, and I'll touch on some of the technical. And then when we get into discussion, I think we can take it where the group can go.
Okay, great. I think that's good. So high level as a default, low level when necessary.
Yeah, and when we're able. So my experience in doing these over many, many years is that we'll have a range of different expertise and interests. And so what we may also do is say, if we have a critical mass of people who want to jump on federated search, for example, we could either say, hey, we'll continue towards the end of the meeting as a smaller group, or we can say, hey, let's all get together again in session 2 in a few hours and just dedicate that strictly to it and be able to get down into the weeds. Great. Any other questions or comments? That was an excellent one, Pierre, because I think that comes up often, and the reason why at the Polar Data Forum we've now split into sort of different streams. Okay, well, with that, we do have a chat monitor, and if we need to just jump in verbally as I'm presenting, because I don't have the chat up at the moment. I'll see if I can get that up, but it does obscure my view, so I'll maybe just look for verbal cues. as I said, my name is Peter Pulsfer. I'm chair of this group. In my day job, I'm an associate professor at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. I also still hold a small appointment at the National Snow and Ice Data Center at University of Colorado. And for, I guess, about 6 years, almost 6 years now, I've chaired the IASA Arctic Data Committee, and I'm technical lead with the Canadian Consortium for Arctic Data Interoperability. I've been working for about not quite 20 years in polar data. I started in 1999 working on Antarctic data, did that through 2006 or so, and then moved into the Arctic. In the Arctic, I focus on working primarily with indigenous communities in the Arctic, but my background is in GIS, remote sensing, and particularly geosemantics. So today, I just want to do a bit of a whirlwind tour of some of the recent activities that we've had in the community. I think we're hitting a bit of a phase change here in our community. For many years, we've had a relatively small group of people working on Arctic data, Antarctic data, and so on. The interest is really increasing. The people who have a mandate to care about this is increasing. The level of funding is increasing. So I think we're now shifting into a discussion of, okay, how do we take what's been happening, particularly since the International Polar Year, and take it forward? What do we need to do, not only technically, but in terms of our community building? So I won't say a lot to each of these slides, but just to say that we do have many different organizations, projects, programs, people, etc., who are working in this space. We have, I think, a good, at least preliminary or proto framework for cooperation through organizations like Arctic Council, like the related SEON, IASC, etc. Many national organizations that bring people together, as well as global initiatives like Global Cryosphere Watch, and many others. So I think moving forward, we have a good foundation, very specifically with respect to ensuring that all rights holders, stakeholders, and others are included. We also need to recognize in the Arctic that Indigenous knowledge and information systems are very important, and there's a growing group actively working to share Indigenous knowledge in appropriate ways. There is definitely some work to do. I think we need to recognize that there's not always the engagement that you want or the collaboration, and there are many reasons for that. And I think some of it is simply that it's not a level playing field in terms of the Indigenous organizations, at least the ones that I work with, do not have the same level of resources to put towards this topic as many research institutes might, and so on. So they are working on that. I've been trying to support wherever possible through Arctic Data Committee, for example. We're working on even basic things like travel support, etc. But an area that we do need some improvement, I think. Just understanding the system is, I think, an important aspect of the work that we're doing. It is a fairly complex space. This is just a screen grab of an initiative where we're looking at mapping the polar data ecosystem, and that's in multiple dimensions. So the screenshot that you see, thanks to Ruth Durer and the Polder group, the work that they're doing, trying to look at federated search and metadata sharing and so on. So this is a database that we've developed to try and understand, those linkages to help us make decisions, plan, and so on. And we have many other views that we're working on. So I think that in and of itself is important. It's, many of us who've worked in this for a while sort of have this in our heads, but even people like us are getting surprised at how many different organizations or entities are part of our community. So we've been a fairly active bunch, and I certainly won't go into the details here, but certainly since IPY, with the IPY International Polar Year workshop in 2006, we've been very active. These are various activities, workshops, etc., that have been happening since then, right up to this week, which is the Arctic Observing 2020. So different hosts for these types of things. Some are national, some are international, etc. And we're not always getting exactly where we want coming out of these, but I think each one has moved us forward in terms of community building. From that, there's actually a study that's ongoing at the moment that we're putting together into a paper that analyzes the community reports. I'll be doing a push on this following this meeting. And really what we've identified, if you go through those reports, are some common themes that we're talking about, and they're generally under social and organizational, community building, funding, engaging Arctic's indigenous peoples, et cetera. And then the technical side, overall interoperability and standards, data discovery, federated search comes up, and more recently emergence of data platforms and e-signs and so on. So currently, Arctic Data Committee has been fairly active in just trying to convene or bring people together and organizations. That's been done though with many, many partners. WMO, Global Cryosphere Watch, Arctic Spatial Data Infrastructure, you can read the list there. And there are many others, so that sort of logo cloud there. So we've all been working together to try to organize and to bring us together to move us forward on various themes and topics as were outlined in the previous slides. This is in the context of many different movements. So we have, for example, the FAIR data movement, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So most of you will be familiar with that. I won't say too much more about it. We have other movements such as the new CARE principles that the indigenous communities or indigenous organizations are putting forward and should work in companion with the FAIR principles. So you have a link there if you need to go to that if you're not familiar with it. And actually, one of the leads, Stephanie Carroll will be, Russo Carroll will be speaking one of the panels for Arctic Observing Summit. She's the overall, I think, lead on the CARE principles. I think something that's different now than certainly when I started, and particularly even during IPY, there are many more funded projects and programs. So this is an issue that, or an opportunity and a challenge that we haven't had in the past, where we have pretty well resourced organizations. Some like NSIDC have been around for a long time, but they were a relatively small number of organizations. Now we have a larger and larger number of data centers, of programs and projects. So figuring out how we work together and how we coordinate, I think, is becoming more interesting. To that end, some of you attended the Polar Data Forum that was held in November, and we really started shifting our operations or our approach there. It started actually with the Polar Data Planning Summit that happened a couple of years ago in 2018. But what we've done is moved away from strictly having conferences where we do, information sharing, and started working into working groups and hackathons and that type of thing. And that's where we're starting, I think, get some really good work done, although we recognize that it's fairly sporadic. So I think during AOS, what I'd like to do is have some discussion about how we can try and maybe formalize that more, get things into a more consistent pattern. While at the Polar Data Forum, in addition to the hackathons, et cetera, we talked about the bigger issues as well: community building, broader context, connection to things like the roads process that we'll hear a little bit later in this session. Polder is a group that's looking at federated search for the polar regions. So I won't say too much about that, but I know we have Taco and Ruth and a number of others who are quite active in that group, and maybe during our open discussion we can focus on some of the work that's being done there. The semantics and vocabularies, or vocabularies and semantics working group, so one that a number of us are also quite active on. So that's something that I think is quite foundational and requires continued effort and attention. And that was something that we looked at as well, or worked on during the Polar Data Forum. I think the key outcomes from that meeting was that we do need continued community building. So we needed to prepare for AOS, engagement in the new roads process, et cetera. The federated search and semantics are key. And then what's starting to really become a big part of the discussion now is platforms and model-based science. So we have a number of e-science or model-based science platforms that are emerging. One that's specific to the polar regions, the Polar Thematic Exploitation Platform that ESA has primarily funded. CCATI's engaging with that group as well. We have the big ones like Google Earth Engine. We have a number of specific ones in Europe and North America, Canada, etc. So these are coming on. They're becoming a big part of our ecosystem, and I think we need to think about where they're situated. So next steps, we have this meeting. And so from this meeting, we want to get some good discussion going. We had, of course, all expected to have an in-person meeting. That didn't happen, but we're happy that we could at least try and keep momentum going through this virtual approach. What I'd like to do in this meeting is throughout the process to just review and confirm priorities based on past and current activities, particularly gap analysis. Is there anything in the list that we've been looking at that is missing that we really need to pay more attention to? We want to look at the white papers, so we'll start in this session having a little presentation from those who are able to, and I'll summarize the other two just after these slides quickly. And then most of the activity would be around discussing and establishing strategies and methods to address the sub-themes. So, federated search, semantics, all of those types of things. How can we move forward? And then, of course, drafting a statement. Similar to AOS 2018 and 2018, we put together basically a statement that said, as a community, we want to develop. We called it an architecture. Lots of discussion whether we can call it that, but it was a word that seemed to resonate with the people that we were trying to communicate with. For an international interconnected Arctic data system. So that one was quite general, I would say, higher level. In this case, we may want to dig down a bit more into the weeds of specifically what we want to do going forward. So some framing questions that I want to put out there that as we're going through our discussions. So what do we need to focus on, I think is critical. And that can range from very high level to very, very low level, technical things. Who do we need to engage? So organizations, programs, projects, people, etc. And how do we link the people, the organizations, and particularly through the scales? So we have, global initiatives right down to local and everywhere in between. So how do we make this top down and bottom up linkage? There's actually a working group 5 under AOS that is focusing particularly on linking to the global initiatives. So this would be related to that. And then, like anything, what is most urgent? So what are the things that we need to be doing, right now and yesterday? And what are the things that, need to be done, but perhaps a little bit further on? So that is a high level sort of overview. With respect to white papers, I haven't yet heard back from Cameron Plank, but this is something that I think we want to think about. And I know that Allison and others, it really relates to what they're looking at with the observing assets, is how do we think about designing end-to-end systems where the sensors can connect right on through, to the full data life cycle, data management stream, and also observers. So people who are observing in the Arctic, how do they fit and how does this all work together? So the white papers are available on the website, so I won't sort of read it to you. There's just a few points here, but the Planck paper is a good example of where we have a relatively, what I'll call a local group or a smaller group designing their own sensor and then thinking about how does it fit into the overall system. And so obviously technically on a case-by-case basis, we could figure out solutions there, but we need to think about how we would do that more systematically. Tom's going to tell us about this paper, so I won't go into that. And then we'll also have Henrik talk about this paper, so I won't go into that. Ivan Sudakov had to withdraw, but the paper is still online. This brings up this question theme of incorporating model output and new technologies and methods like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all of that. So I think just general statement there, where does that fit and how are we going to be thinking about that as a community? And then Bill Manley will present in another session, and Allison is online, but their initiative is looking at, it's similar to what I talked about with respect to documenting the Arctic data ecosystem, but this is focused more on the observing assets and how do we document the assets and then make that metadata interoperable. So I will leave it there. And before I introduce Tom and Henrik, if there are any questions or comments, suggestions on where people want to take things. Okay, I see a chat window. Okay, if there are no questions or comments, great. I'm just checking out the chat quickly, and I see we have a couple of others who have joined us. Hironori Yabuki, welcome. Great to see you online. And I don't see any others. I thought I had seen another, but with that, I'm going to ask Tom Barry to present on their white paper. And Tom, you should be able to share your screen, or I do have your presentation, and I could put it up if need be.
I will try and share my screen and see what happens.
Okay.
So does that work? Do you see everything?
We do.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. And, I'm drinking lots of coffee to try and get myself going here. But I'm a geographer and I work within the Arctic Council, specifically within its working group that deals with biodiversity. And as we're talking about data and interoperability, I found this map there just yesterday when I was preparing this presentation, which I thought was great because it fits perfectly for an awful lot of what AOS is discussing. And this only dates from, I think, the 1890s. So it's good to have that to remind us of where we're going. So within the Arctic Council, it's had a fragmented approach to how it works with making the data that it generates through its various activities accessible to people. And in 2013, the Council approved a whole suite of recommendations based upon the first circumpolar assessment of status and trends on Arctic biodiversity. And the key recommendations that came from that assessment that were approved by the foreign ministers were that we needed to develop tools for data sharing, to facilitate data collection, and to improve access to information. So in response to those recommendations, what CAF did was we developed and started to put in place a system known as the Arctic Biodiversity Data Service, or the ABDS. And the intention with this ABDS is that it's an online interoperable system, and any activities conducted by CAF that generate biodiversity data, be it spatial or otherwise, are made accessible and immediately online so that they're available to other people in the community who are working on similar issues to use that information, and so that's archived for future use. And our policy is that the majority of information that we receive through our activities is funded by taxpayers somewhere, so it should be free and accessible to people, with the exceptions as if people are publishing information or if there's some perhaps sensitive information, for example, nesting sites and things like this, then we try and not make that information publicly accessible. And that screenshot that you see there is from a report in 2017, which reflects the Arctic Protected Areas database. And you can access the information online as a service, however you want to make most use out of it. So this is a very simple diagram that just briefly provides an overview of the ABDS. It's built upon a system of an open source software, GeoServer and GeoNetwork, and also makes use of the integrated publishing toolkit developed by GBIF for use by GBIF and OBIS. We work with an awful lot of partners, but these four at the bottom of the screen are sort of key partners that we work in exchanging knowledge and experience and making sure our systems are interoperable with. That's the Arctic Spatial Data Infrastructure, or the mapping cooperation between the Arctic mapping agencies, GBIF, OBIS, and GEOS. CAF is the Arctic node within OBIS, and all of the information that we generate through our marine and coastal monitoring activities flows into that. And it's been very effective for us in helping us keep track of who's using our information, how it's been used, so that we can demonstrate the relevance of the work that we're doing. And as I mentioned, it's just since 2013 that we started to get the ABD, a lot of data and information, which is proving very helpful in our work. We're also an Arctic node, or the Arctic node within GBIF, and again, the intention is that any time information is published through CAF, it's automatically shared with GBIF and OBIS. And this particular screenshot shows you, I think it's our seabird monitoring work. And again, this is very helpful. We've linked our systems to GBIF and OBIS so we can see citations, occurrences, who's using the information, and who's accessing it. And it helps us a lot in trying to spread knowledge about what we're doing and try to access information from those systems relevant for our work as well. This is just a very simple screen grab there. You can see that the level, or the amount of information that's stored within CAF's activities has started to increase significantly since 2013. And there's a huge jump in 2015 because that's when we instigated a series of what are known as Arctic Biodiversity Congresses, which have a data component where we try to bring together stakeholders from industry, government, academia to look at issues around Arctic biodiversity. And you can see that they've had a very significant impact in people being aware of the ABDS and also in provision of data and access to it within our system. One of the key things, of course, that came from the recommendations from the biodiversity assessment was not just that we had to make information available, but we also had to make information available in a format that people understood and can make use of. And the screenshot that you see in front of you now is one example of how we're trying to make information about marine monitoring biodiversity information accessible. So in this wheelied diagram, each segment represents a specific Arctic marine area. Each concentric circle represents a specific focal ecosystem component. And these are the key components of the marine ecosystem that we manage, or we monitor or assess information on. And because if there's a change in those components, then it indicates a greater overall change. And you can very quickly then see where we have information, where we don't have information, where there are gaps in our knowledge. And this type of a tool is proving very, very effective in helping us convey to policy and decision makers why something like the Arctic Biodiversity Data Service is needed, and why within the Council we need to have a greater focus on how we share and manage information. And this is just one example of a whole suite of tools that we're trying to experiment with to try and get our messages across to those who make decisions on funding and use of this data. This is a screenshot of a similar tool, but this one is focused on rivers, on monitoring activities conducted in rivers across the Arctic. And in this case, each segment represents a specific state. And you can see very quickly where there's routine monitoring, where there's gaps in our monitoring. So we try to convey information on where we have monitoring, where we don't, where we have information on status and trends, and where we don't, and where things might be better focused. And these type of tools are helping a lot in helping us inform and guide people when they're assigning funding and resources to these type of activities in the Arctic. This screenshot here is just one of dealing with freshwater biodiversity. So the Arctic Council has delivered huge amounts of assessments over the years, but one of its challenges is once these assessments are delivered, the data behind them not delivered. It's not accessible, it's not archived anywhere. And we're very happy that our most recent assessment on the state of the Arctic's freshwater biodiversity, it is accompanied by a fully integrated database on all of the information that we collected across the Arctic. And we're just in the process now of finalizing ownership permissions to share that information. And we hope that that data set will prove perhaps a model for how the Arctic Council might look at the types of information it collects on Arctic ecosystems and stressors and biodiversity into the future. And we hope to make that available quite soon. These are just sort of samples of the types of different activities that we're undertaking within the framework of the ABDS. And this screenshot here represents sort of the data management system that we're developing for our seabird monitoring work within the Arctic Council. And here, each Arctic state uploads their colony counts, their status and trends information at the end of each season. And it's helping us develop sort of very quick fact sheets at the end of the year on the status of seabird colonies and things like this. So as you can see, we're trying a lot of different ways to try and make sure that our information is used and is accessible. One area that we're starting to look at quite a lot as well now, of course, is that of remote sensing and how we can use that more effectively in the work that we do. And as part of that process, we've gone through an initiative looking at MODIS, where we've identified a suite of about 14 climate change indicators across the Arctic and tried to extract information from those on MODIS over the last 20 years or so. And we've just published a paper on that just last month, actually, which provides sort of an overview of where we are with that type of work. We provide every 2 years progress reports on what we've done with biodiversity data within the context of the Council to the Arctic Council. So those reports are there if people would like to have more detail on the structure of the system, the type of information it contains, and how you might like to engage with it. Some nice things that have happened since we've pushed ABDS and started to put more and more emphasis on this is that also our monitoring program has been recognized as the Biodiversity Observation Network within GeoBon. And it's one example of how access to information can help facilitate better coordination when it comes to monitoring as well. And I think maybe I'll keep that very short and sweet because I know we don't have a lot of time and it's better to discuss rather than to listen to someone talk. So I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any, and otherwise I'll leave it there, Peter.
Great, thank you, Tom. We do have a little bit of time for questions, and as you've seen in the chat, if you would like to ask a question, please use the raise hand function and we'll manage that way.
And this is just a very high-level overview of some of the different activities that we do in biodiversity data within the Arctic Council context.
Great, so I have Pierluigi, and actually, sorry, I will hand over the, the chat monitoring to Jennifer.
Hi there, so yeah, Pierre's got a question, thank you.
Right. So thanks very much. It's a great presentation. It's really nice to see how the interoperability starts at the organizational level, you know, nesting within GeoBon, nesting within GBIF and OBIS. And it's a consideration that we have when we're drafting the UN Ocean Decade strategy for data. And it sounds really good. How successful has that been? Do you feel that that has really helped with the lower level data integration?
I think the answer is it's a work in progress. Increasingly, we're starting to see that it is having an impact. A nice example of how it can have an impact is that part of our work on seabirds, because I mentioned that in the presentation, was we monitor particular species with conservation strategies for seabird species. And as a result of information that we collected as part of that process, that actually helped to inform changes in local government rules and regulations when it comes to conservation and management of seabird colonies. So you can draw very nice lines between making this information available and making it have an impact on the ground as well when it comes to specific conservation impacts. We also have an agreement with our framework of agreements with the various UN biodiversity relevant conventions such as the CBD and the Convention on Migratory Species, and they've made decisions based upon the work that we've done to ask us to report in on what's happening with biodiversity in the Arctic. So increasingly we're starting to provide reports and information on the Sustainable Development Goals, the Aichi targets, and how the Arctic as a region might support reporting on progress towards their achievement. So, I mean, there's a long way to go, but both in terms of on-the-ground impacts and impacting on Sustainable Development Goals at a broader regional and global level, it's having, I think, a significant impact.
Thank you, TT. Peter just wants to have an input on that as well.
Yes, thank you, Tom. That was a great presentation. I have a number of points, but I think some of it we can save for the discussion. But I noticed that you have, your GeoNetwork, GeoServer, et cetera, in your stack. What kind of uptake have you had or interest have you had in the data as a service as opposed to downloading shapefiles, for example, so using web feature services, web map services, et cetera?
When researchers or scientists are using it, they download the information by and large because they want to fiddle with it, change it, and integrate it into what they're doing. But there's been more of an uptake in terms of services when it comes to organizational usage, such as, for example, the mapping agencies and their initiative, the Arctic Spatial Data Infrastructure. They want to access the information in terms of services, and the same with GeoBon and GEOS and so forth. So on an individual level, people want the actual information to work with, which I understand myself. And on an organizational level, people are more interested in finding the services.
Great, thank you.
I noticed, Matt James, you had your hand up. Did you need to ask a question or has it been answered already? Matt, if you want to go ahead and unmic and ask your question.
Sorry, I thought Peter was going to get there, but they didn't go there. So I was wondering about what Peter started in on was discussing the GeoNetwork working. You showed a graph of, I don't know, cumulative number of data sets that you have done, reached maybe 35,000. Were those data sets or were those occurrence records?
They were, sorry, I have to go back up and see what I actually put on the screen for you. These were occurrence records within our OBIS node.
Okay. So how many biological data sets outside of occurrence records do you have that are across the whole CAF network?
Across the whole CAF, I couldn't say offhand. I can check when we finish these questions and see. The challenge is that an awful lot of the work within the council, it's sort of discrete data sets. So it's very often multiple fragmented data sets. One of our challenges is how do we get people when they're doing this work to collect that information in a way that we can actually make better use of it. I guess there's a couple of hundred data sets in there. So a lot of our work is in making sure that upcoming information is actually delivered into the data service. But also we go back and try to rescue and archive historical data sets that have been produced previously by the council as well. So I don't know the exact number of data sets, but there's a couple of hundred anyway.
Okay. Yeah, so we have had a similar experience trying to archive data sets, and they're just so diverse. It's been hard to characterize how you would integrate them across the data sets that we archive. And so I was surprised to see so many in one collection, but it makes more sense that there are occurrence records there. So
yeah, there are occurrence records, and that's why we're quite excited about this freshwater biodiversity data set, because it's the first time they have like a large Arctic-wide database or report assessment that's accompanied by a fully integrated data set, which is quite nice, and that's the model that we want to foster into the future. But of course, that's difficult to attain.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for that. I think Jonathan Blythe has raised his hand in the chat room. Do you have a question, Jonathan? If you want to unmute, sorry, and ask a question.
Yeah, hi, this is Jonathan. I just wanted to ask if you guys have looked at and incorporated the ecological atlas of Bering, Chukchi, and Beaufort Sea that was produced by Audubon, Alaska?
No, it's not incorporated within our work, but it has been raised as something that might actually we should look at. And it was actually raised, I think, Jonathan, by Bowen, because your organization has recently taken on the co-lead role of our monitoring program, and it was brought up in a recent call by Kathy Kuhn, is the US representative there.
Yes.
And so it's something that's been discussed, but it's not included.
And that raises the question, if you would integrate an atlas, which is, basically a summary of occurrences or other kinds of biological data, or if you were looking only at data sets that are the raw data, so to speak.
Well, I mean, the majority of the data that comes through the Arctic Council isn't raw data. It's by and large synthesized data that's collected through an assessment process. But what we have been doing is that we have been working with within the Interact initiative, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, where we've had a process over the last 3 years where we've been developing a user manual for how field stations might implement our ecosystem monitoring plans for freshwater and terrestrial biodiversity, and how they might actually then deliver that information into the ABDS. And that's actually my deadline to deliver on that is tomorrow, so I must finalize my reporting on that. So yeah, so we're looking at how stations might deliver raw data into an Arctic Council assessment process, but the majority of information in the ABDS at the moment is the result of synthesizing activities through assessment and monitoring on a regional level.
Thank you.
Great. I think with that, we'll move on just in the interest of time, but we do have time to come back and have dialogue. So keep any questions that you have, and we can do that through discussion. For now, I would like to ask Henrik to say a few words, or if you have a presentation, you can share your screen, Henrik, about the Copernicus white paper that you submitted.
Yes, thank you, Peter. Let's see if I'm as clever as Tom. I will try to share my screen. Let's see. So this one. So
that works well.
Hope you can see it now. So this is a fairly high level presentation. And as you know, of course, the white paper is also quite high level. I mean, so all this this discussion about specific data sets and all that, I mean, that's not what we are trying to do here. So, I mean, we are taking this opportunity to inform the community at the Arctic Observing Summit about what Copernicus is doing in the Arctic region. I mean, I would like to see, I would like to see Copernicus as part of the Arctic Integrated Observing System in a way. So this is I mean, I'm going to provide you with a very, very brief introduction to Copernicus, and then a bit more information about the work that we have been doing, specifically about the data needed by the Copernicus in the Arctic region. So, I mean, I don't know, and of course, I apologize if you know all this, but very briefly, Copernicus is the European Union's Earth observation program. It's funded by the Commission. It's implemented by a number of what we call entrusted entities, including the European Space Agency, European Organization for the Exploitation of Meteorological Satellites, the European Center for Medium Weather Range Forecasts, and EU agencies such as my own, the European Environment Agency, and also MacArthur Ocean. So it's a huge, huge program. And it delivers a vast amount of global data from satellites and ground-based observations, also from the Arctic region. All the information produced and data and services produced by Copernicus are freely and openly accessible to all users. It's a user-driven, a policy-driven program, including also, of course, the EU Arctic policy. So just also to make this very clear, I mean, when we talk about Copernicus, we actually talk about 3 different components. So there's the space component with the 7 sentinels in there. We talk about the services. So we have 6 services focusing on climate, ocean, land, atmosphere, of course. And we have what we call the Copernicus in situ component. And the in situ component is actually a kind of a virtual component, because Copernicus relies more or less entirely on existing in situ data capacities. So of course, contributions from member states, organizations, networks, and so on are really essential contributions to Copernicus when we talk about in situ data. This is very, very important to emphasize, because we do not have Copernicus as such. We do not have instrumentation floating around anywhere, in fact. But we are involved in a number of in situ data related activities, such as data rescue, data collection, quality control, and so on and so forth. So observations, of course, from a sustained and coordinated Arctic observing system underpinned by long-term observation strategy are therefore essential to Copernicus. I mean, this is important, of course. The Copernicus services and the space component, I mean, they work directly with the in situ data providers, and they get the data they need, they work with the networks. But the European Environment Agency, where I work, we have been asked by the Commission to try to coordinate across the space component, across the services, and that's actually what we try to do. So for looking at when we talk about the having access or requirements for in situ data, we need to understand that Copernicus is a long-term operational program, and continuity of service is a priority to our member states. It's really, really important to understand this. So when we talk about getting access to in situ data, we also need to keep in mind that we are talking about a long-term operational program. It's not a research program in any way. We are looking about data until, let's say, 2040 or something like that, maybe even longer. As I said, I would like to see Copernicus as a component of the integrated observing system. The Copernicus space component delivers satellite data to users, a lot of satellite data, I have to say, also covering the Arctic region. The Copernicus services, they deliver products and services to users. Basic product, you can say, which will then be used by users also in the Arctic region. And of course, when we are looking to the future, when we talk about Copernicus high priority candidate missions, which we are looking at now, some of them are really also very relevant for the Arctic region, as you may know. Like say the microwave mission and the topographic mission, for example. But at the same time, when we talk about high priority candidate missions, we also talk about a continuity of what's already there. So it's not that we are going to move away from Sentinel-1, Sentinel-2, or whatever. We are talking about actually extending the space component. That's what we are looking at right now. So it's also clear, of course, that Copernicus products and services need access to essential in situ data. It's also clear that the Copernicus services is included in, are involved in collecting, analyzing, storing, and making all these in situ observations available. But it's also clear when we talk about in situ data and when we try to coordinate across the services, our starting point is always the products of the services and the data from the space component. So that's really the starting point for us when we talk about requirements and we talk about the data that we need for Copernicus. It is clear also that, and at a very early point in time, some years ago, in fact, we talked about this and the Arctic region and the importance of getting access to data from the Arctic region with the Copernicus service and the space segment people, and they all articulated a somewhat strong concern regarding the availability of data. And again, we need to keep in mind when we talk about availability, it's about data to an operational long-term program. So they wanted us, in fact, to try to analyze what is the situation. When we look at the products produced and the data delivered by Copernicus right now, what kind of data do we use already? What kind of data do we need in addition? And this is really also part of the background information for the white paper. So we produced this report. It's available on our website, and the basic idea was simply to get an overview of the data available and used, and of unused data, and of course about the gaps. So what we did was to identify Arctic in situ data requirements relevant for the Copernicus services and the space component. We documented the existence and availability of in situ data relevant for the services and the space component, and of course we also looked at some gaps. The main thing is, of course, that if we want to make full use of the satellite data delivered by Copernicus, we need to have access to the right data for calibration and validation. And of course, at the end also, if we want to provide data of sufficient quality from the Marine Service, from the Climate Service, from the Atmosphere Service, they need access to data for assimilation, for validation, quality control, and so on. So some of the conclusions, of course, and they are probably not surprising for you at all. I mean, we noted that especially in the Central Arctic, some of these data are simply not available. Also services, they told us, okay, yes, the quality is of course important, but the amount of data is actually of bigger importance. Also, we noticed that insufficient data management at producer level could be a challenge in terms of formats and metadata, accessibility, timely delivery, quality of documentation. And of course, we noted that a number of interesting data would be available from the Russians, which are difficult to get access to, and we probably would need to do more to see if we can exploit some of our contacts there and try to get access to more data. So this is some of the conclusions. And of course, we also saw that, I mean, Copernicus as such also need to try to in a coordinated way to work with bodies, international government, intergovernmental bodies already active in this region, like CERN, like WMO, IOC, GEO. And of course, this is because we want to make aware the requirements and the gaps that we see, which are important for Copernicus, but it's also, I mean, to actually support the work already being done by these organizations, if we can. Of course, also we see that there's a need for developing the observing system from a technology point of view, data communication point of view, and we have this opportunity to actually provide input to the European Horizon Europe research project program, and this is also a road that we will try to follow to actually try to provide input to future calls. And of course, what we have also in the concept of Copernicus is that we try to set up international cooperation arrangements with certain countries like Canada and the US, for example. The one with US is already signed. The one with Canada is going to be signed quite soon, I think. And of course, these cooperation arrangements also contains an in situ data component. It contains also, of course, elements like, for example, access to satellite data and so on, but also a Copernicus, also an in situ component or element which we will try to leverage and try to get more access to more data through these cooperation arrangements. In the short term, we will, as I said, try to cooperate with the existing networks and organizations, and also some of the main research programs. We will try to focus on data rescue, and of course, we have already now started work on trying to find a way to document more precisely exactly what kind of research data are available, which would be of relevance to Copernicus. This is ongoing work, and we hope to have some conclusions ready before the summer break. But we realized quite soon that actually there is a lot of very useful research data out there that could be used for validating Copernicus products. These data are not easily discoverable, and we need to try to establish an overview where we can get access to the data, to these data, and that's actually what we are trying to do. So this is really short-term actions, but just to inform you about where we are right now. I can also inform you that Erik Buch, who is also part of this meeting, actually was the lead author of this in situ requirements and data report about the Arctic, So he's available also here, and he may be able to provide an answer to some of your more technical questions. But I think I'll stop here, and I hope that that I've managed to provide you with some idea of what we are trying to do here.
Great, thank you very much, Henrik. I'll put it out to the floor for questions.
Hello, Pierre. Do you want to ask your question?
Thank you. Thanks very much for that. It's great to see. Over in Germany, there are, of course, quite a lot of data holdings that are in the same situation. We have lots of granular individual data sets that can't be fed into larger infrastructures because, well, they're all over the place. These calls that are coming from Copernicus and others, are these in a document that I can take to, let's say, the management level of these data resources and say, look, like there's mounting pressure, there's a mounting need. Is there a way that I can articulate that from your side?
So, I mean, so what exactly do you mean by calls? I mean, do you mean
a published statement, a white paper of some kind, something that is a very clear call to action for others?
Yeah, what we try to do is that, I mean, at the European Environment Agency, as I said, we are responsible for cross-cutting coordination of the in situ component. So we try to do this like writing reports. We always base these reports on input we get from the services and the space component. So in this case, for the Arctic, we have a report available on our website, and the website is insitu.copernicus.eu. And there you can find the report on the Arctic region. Of course, it's not the final report, but you can find useful information in there. I'm pretty sure. We realize, of course, that it is really important to get back to the data providers and also to member states and countries, organizations, and inform about the challenges that we see. And we try to do that. You may know that when we talk about governance and the Copernicus program, we have what we call the user forum, Copernicus user forum, and we have also the Copernicus committee, where member states are actually sitting. And we try to inform them on a regular basis about where we are with respect to in situ data. And now we have also a specific report on where we are vis-a-vis the Arctic region.
Can I ask something?
Sure.
Henrik, thank you very much for this complete overview, and I especially like the part where you talked about cooperation. I see many similarities with things going on within IUDE, and I would like to discuss this further with you. The question is, in one of your first few slides, you showed why Copernicus needs in situ data, and then you mentioned, sort of one of the bullets was that Copernicus will also make available these data. I wonder why is that going on, because apparently if you get the data, then the data must have been made available by these other in situ data collectors. So why would you make data available then again? Because this way you get kind of near duplicates.
Yeah, I mean the way we are trying to do this is that that, for example, if we take the Marine Service as an example, they are trying to work with a number of data providers all over the globe, in fact. And they have, as part of the Marine Service, they have established what they call the in situ thematic assembly center, which is responsible for collecting all this, so it can be used by the service for producing and validating their products. So that's actually what they are trying to do, but they are trying to do this in close cooperation with existing centers. So we are not talking about duplication. We are talking about, in fact, a huge amount of work required to collect all this, to quality control, to make it available online, both for internal use and also for external use. Of course, they make certain that this is not duplication of work. The same is true for the climate service. They have what they call the climate data store, and again, it's really an opportunity to have access to data sets from a number of providers. So instead of having to going into several places, you can simply go to the data. Climate data store and find the data there, and also data that they try to rescue will be made available through this data climate store along with all the products they produce. So these data can be used for actually on your own. I mean, you can validate the data, for example, the reanalysis. So you have access not only to the product as such, the reanalysis, but also to the data which actually went into the production of the product. But you're right. I mean, we need to be very, very cautious not to duplicate work. But this is not what is happening here.
Thank you for that. Jonathan Blythe has got his hand up again in chat. Could you go ahead and ask your question?
Yes, thanks. Right now in the Earth Science Information Partners, which is a organization in the U.S. that works with data centers, government organizations, and the industry and NGOs on data management for Earth science information. They're currently looking at an issue for in reinventing their data discovery focus, their kind of research and development focus on the leading front of data discovery to try to better capture use of data. And so what I'm seeing here and what you're doing for Copernicus and these in situ measurements is using them in one particular way, which is different from the way that the data were, these in situ data were collected. They had an original project they were supporting perhaps, or a program, and here you're reusing them. And that itself is an important something that's important to capture for data discovery. And you can do you can support a lot of that without even touching data sets. You can just annotate that in a catalog, for example. So part of what ESIP is doing is trying to come up with that knowledge graph catalog concept so we can capture use of data.
Yes, and I can say that of course these in situ data collections that are being created by the service, of course they will be of use to end users as well. In this case, these data are primarily being collected in order to produce the products requested by the end users. Also, I have to say that and this is the general challenge, of course, is that we see that when we compare the long-term strategy of Copernicus with some of the networks that we really depend on, there's a challenge because some of them are what we call research infrastructures. And especially this issue is well known, and I also know that the European European research program is very much aware of this, and is trying to find ways to actually support research infrastructures in the future. But it is a challenge, but something we hope to be able to circumvent in some way. But Copernicus plays a role also there. I mean, apart from collecting and controlling a lot of data, setting up coordination and all that, the Copernicus program is also directly supporting some of these research networks to ensure that actually data are being made available on top of what they are supposed to do. I mean, exactly to make them available for research. Moving from research into an operational program, being useful for an operational program, will require additional funding, and that's actually what Copernicus is trying to do.
Thank you for that, Henrik. I think Peter wants to speak now.
Great, thank you. I just have a question, then a comment, and then I'd like to move us into our open discussion. So my question is related to the agreements that you mentioned with Canada and with other countries. These appear to be bilateral agreements. Is there, if that's the case, let me know, but if not, you know, is there a global mechanism that could think about multilateral agreements, or does that not work legally? You know, what are your thoughts in terms of ensuring that you have all of the agreements that you need in place?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I mean, the cooperation arrangements that I talked about would be bilateral agreements with a country, between a country and the European Commission. But I know that they are trying to work on setting up something similar for the WMO, for example. So it is possible also to have these cooperation arrangements with organizations. And that is actually what we are trying to do based on our findings, to convince the Commission that actually we need to do this also somehow in the future. But I have to say that it is entirely up to the European Commission to decide whether they are going to set up an agreement or not. But I know for sure that they are trying to do that with WMO. And we may be able to do this with other organizations in the future. The cooperation arrangements are primarily set up to allow a given country privileged access to sentinel data, and also to ensure that some kind of data is actually being made available in return. So it could be space data, it could be in situ data. For some countries, they do not simply have space data available. So in that case, it is obvious that we are trying to leverage these cooperation arrangements to get access to more in situ data.
Great. Thank you very much for that. My comment is that what you've highlighted here in your presentation, there's many topics, but one of them is this connection between, you know, long-term major programs, and then what we think about as the long tail, you know, data collected by projects and individual researchers, et cetera. And then also sustainability, et cetera, that you highlight in your white paper. So I would say that I think this fits squarely into what we'll hear about with the Say on Roads process that Sandy Starkweather is going to present at around the top of the hour. So I'd like to maybe come back to your presentation after Sandy speaks, because I think this is a really good example of what we need to be doing as a community. With that, I would like to get us going into our general open discussion. And Alison Gaylord, I see that you have a question, and I would like you to actually start us off, because I get the sense that there's an appetite here for some discussion about some of the details, particularly around federation and metadata. I would like to come back a bit later, though. I have a question comment for the group in relation to community building. So, Alison, can I ask you to present your question?
Sure, yes. Thank you for the overview on Copernicus. I was particularly interested in if you guys have adopted a standard for cataloging the in situ assets. You mentioned a couple of related initiatives, some work with WMO. I was curious if you're if you've implemented WIGOS or are using the OGC specs for observations and measurements, et cetera.
Yes, what we're trying to do is really to rely on existing standards. So it's clear that we are looking towards OSCAR, for example, the OMIO initiatives and other similar initiatives, but we are not trying to create our own catalog or anything like that. We simply also in this case rely on what's going on in other organizations. Our main purpose is really to get this overview, to identify the gaps, and then in case we can support some of these initiatives, if it makes sense for Copernicus, we'll try to do that. But I know also for the services, what they try to do is really to work with open standards. But all the technical details I do not have, and in case you need more information about this, I would be happy to point you to the right people in some of the services.
Yeah, that would be great. I would love to follow up on behalf of one effort that I've been involved with through the U.S. National Science Foundation's Arctic Observing program, in which we've been pretty focused on cataloging in situ assets, you know, boreholes, moorings, vegetation plots, even areas where there are repeat observations for monitoring of various species. And we don't know that we've adopted an ISO implementation, but we're open to working with other standards. And I guess that leads into a working group that I'm getting involved with as well. And we have a white paper. I'm looking at optimizing Arctic observing through interoperable information sharing across networks. And I think many of us have been really focused on these in situ assets, but I know from other projects I've been involved in over the years that, you know, there's a real need also to define what these assets are, and also looking at community-based monitoring efforts and what is an appropriate way to incorporate those local observations. As well as, you know, information like Tom presented with the CAF studies, where there are repeat shorebird studies happening, for instance. And how do we best accommodate those long-term monitoring efforts as part of that work to be really comprehensive.
Thank you for that, Alison. Peter's put the option in the chat for people to open up discussion. So if anyone has anything they want to discuss, please make that comment in the chat.
Yeah, I was going to, I guess, mention also, Ruth has posted here the work on schema.org that's really taken off, I think, since the Polar Data Forum back in November in Helsinki. I've just been kind of following on the periphery, but that seems to be gaining a lot of traction as perhaps a new interoperable approach for cataloging these types of assets. And maybe Ruth wants to give a little update on that.
I can give an update. I was bringing it up mostly because I have concerns about how that's going. One, there are groups who are very active on this front. The Science on Schema.org is actually under the ESIP-Fed GitHub arena. And they're working on updates. Really, I guess it's two paths forward. One, trying to steer the schema.org ship a bit, which is a hard go, since you need to convince a much larger community than just earth science or science in general that changes are needed. But also to provide guidance to repositories and folks who are trying to advertise their data holdings in how to do that in a more standard way for earth science. The issue I see there is that without a lot of input from actual repositories on those guidance and guidelines, it's very unlikely that that this will improve the situation much beyond where we're at currently, because as probably many of you know, just saying that something is a standard and you're using it does not imply that things are going to be very interoperable, because in most cases you can say it's a standard, but everybody's using the fields differently, so it's not that standardized. And so that is my concern with those efforts, is that without concerted effort from groups such as this in reviewing and making sure that those kinds of decisions are being made in in a manner that can be supported, it may be an effort for naught, and I guess that's my concern. It is moving very fast, and it is, if you are participating in it, it is quite technical, and also could be overwhelming from a amount of time required.
So can I respond to Ruth? It's Matt.
Well, please, this is
okay.
Ruth. I'd love to hear you.
Thanks. Still not quite sure how the hand raising thing's working or not, whether we're still doing that or not. But yeah, so Ruth, I totally agree with you that it's really difficult to get people to agree, even when you're supposedly using a standard. There's tremendous amount of latitude within them, how you interpret things. And whenever you try to build a federated catalog, it's really difficult to, you find out just how many different ways people interpret the same set of standards very quickly. So I agree, it's a real challenge. I think the nice thing about the scienceonschema.org is it's pretty lightweight. And so everybody can kind of do a small amount of work and start making progress on getting some agreement. So I hope that the guide that was written there is simple enough that people can read it in pretty quick order and hopefully put something together. And I think if we work iteratively and together on trying to refine that so that people can come to some agreement on it, that it would work better than kind of the really formal engineering approach we've taken on some of the other efforts, where you get deeper into schemas and ontologies and all that kind of stuff, which is great stuff too, and I'm very supportive of it. But I think this is a very different approach towards the lightweight side of just identifying what resources are out there. So if everybody hasn't looked at it already, the scienceonschema.org guide that Ruth mentioned, I put a link in the chat to that. And there's about to be a 1.1 release of that to basically update the recommendations in the next, I don't know, week or two. And then there's an effort to keep going and trying to figure out how to improve it even further. So anybody that has comments on that would be really valuable.
And I guess my major point here is that is less of a technical issue than of a community issue. I mean, it's great to define guidance and that sort of thing, but unless that's reviewed by the actual data managers and repository managers to ensure that there's understanding there and that it's within their capacity to do those things, it's not going to have the desired impact. So this is actually a tying the technology to the social part of the whole enterprise.
Yep.
Okay, thank you for that. I think Peter's got a question now or comment.
Okay, mine is more of an update on some of the work that we're doing in Canada that relates to this. So the CCADI group that we mentioned, Canadian Consortium for Arctic Data Interoperability, has been doing a lot of schema.org work. We have a number of members, probably about 5 or 6 now, who are implementing on the publication side of things. And most of them are getting close to at least a development level release soon, if not a production level. We're then looking at aggregation, at least for the CCADI community, that would feed into probably some other aggregation strategies. But it brings up this question that Ruth, I think you point to, about community. So we're certainly aware of the science on schema.org. And we now are starting to run into these things you talked about, as which vocabulary should we be using, what's our schema going to look like, and so on. So the question here, I think, that I would have is, is that forum the place that we all should be meeting? Another thought that I'm having is that this meeting, although forced by the COVID situation, is seeming like it's productive, at least in these first couple of hours, and we know we need to follow up on Helsinki. Would it be helpful for Arctic Data Committee or other partners for us to start organizing regular meetings of our own community that then feeds into science on schema.org? So maybe just some thoughts there on where we should be, and very specifically in our case, pointing the CCADI team to have these discussions in the most productive way.
So Peter, sorry, go ahead, Ruth.
Oh, I was going to say, go ahead, Matt. Okay, well, I think, well, put it this way, there needs to be some place that people are going to for this kind of work. And if they're running into some of these issues already, it would be very good if those issues were brought up in this other venue, either through having somebody from CCADI participate in the schema.org cluster, or maybe writing issues. Hi, this is an issue. We need to have guidance on blah. But I definitely think that from a community standpoint, the earlier we get this organized so that the community is, organized globally to push in the same direction on this, that the better. So whatever that mechanism is, that's great. And yes, if that's an additional telecon series or something like that, that's fine by me. I will say that even getting other parts of the ESIP enterprise to pay attention to this is proving to be somewhat challenging. It's one of those issues where mediators are needed, because we're actually talking about communities who have totally different manners of speaking and concerns. So it's the traditional, how do you get people to communicate?
Thank you for that. Pierre, if you want to ask your question.
Yes, it's a question and also a comment. So this is a conversation also happening for the UN Decade considerations for the data plan. There is a catalog of data providers and services that's run out of ODIS, the Ocean Data Information System. It's in a fairly simple state, and we're thinking about how to progress that. And this sort of brings up the larger question, because I've seen so many groups developing catalogs, and they're really useful, they're extremely important, but they tend to evaporate as soon as the group's funding is over. So the idea of these sort of sustained groups, maybe GEO, maybe UN, who knows, nations, maintaining interoperable catalogs, I think, is one of the first targets of interoperability. Because if we can search across those, say who has what, that's already simplifying the situation greatly and connecting the right people. So whether it's schema.org, whether it's not, some very lightweight, I'm talking about pushing some kind of little statements to to a GitHub repository on each of these players. It needs to be done relatively soon, because otherwise this just keeps going on and on.
Yeah, I agree with you, Pierre.
Yeah, but I mean, then how do we do it, right? So I think a lot, so the catalog builders, I think, whoever's building these catalogs, if we know who's building these catalogs, we need to sort of send put them all in contact and saying, look, the community needs this. We know that you are building these catalogs. Can you please, open up a forum where you're going to try to align as much as possible? You can keep your native ways of doing things internally, but when it comes to interoperability, something has to be pushed out that's lightweight, as Matt said, has to be lightweight and easily, parsed into other people's systems.
Thank you, Pierre. Peter, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think that's a really important observation, Pierre, and priority for us as a community. I would like to highlight that in our statement, partly because I know people in our community see the value of that, the importance and the urgency, but at times it may not seem as urgent to people sort of in a concentric circle outside of us. There's a lot happening, as I mentioned in my intro, in terms of things like, data platforms, e-science platforms, machine learning. All of these things are kind of exciting, and they're not necessarily buzzwords, but they lean towards that. And sometimes we can forget about the fundamentals. So these foundational things that can creep up on us or that just don't get the attention. So if that makes sense, I would like to have this as one of our foundational sort of statements going forward, because I do know certainly in my environment, these things are often brushed aside as kind of not really all that interesting and not very innovative.
I would totally support that. I think that this is a kind of a critical time. If the scienceonschema.org is the direction that people are going to go to come up with these lightweight catalogs, that statement is extremely important, and bringing all the various communities trying to do catalogs together, I agree, is critical to making any of these catalogs interoperable.
Thank you, Ruth. I think Matt has a comment now.
I wanted to follow up on what Pierre said about stability of funding, which is obviously the elephant in the room. I think a lot of people, we all are building catalogs, we're all building systems, we all intend them to be contributing to the solution, not to the problem, but it's also very hard to predict. I don't know how any of us can really predict which programs will have stable funding over the long term. And so I think one of the things that we could be working towards as a community is helping to support each other in building out systems that are interoperable and can have some degree of redundancy and replication across our broader network, so that when inevitably some of those systems do fail, it also doesn't necessarily mean that the data that were housed there are no longer accessible. I think the institutional and administrative, so replication of data assets in interoperable systems across administrative, financial, and national boundaries is probably one of the best ways that we can, over the long term, ensure the stability of our systems. And yet most of our decisions occur within funding lines instead of across them. And so I'd love to see us work towards community models where we can take into consideration that, if you're working within your program only, it's going to be much harder to sustain that and make sure that it's persistent over longer time periods.
This is probably a great opportunity to mention a new working group that's being created under SAON, the Polar Observing Assets Working Group, where I believe some of this activity on developing some lightweight interoperable catalog, whether it's based on schema.org or other evolving standards, could take place, and perhaps some agreement, because I can't agree more about how the projects come and go, and think a lot of us are developing these catalogs and want to see them live on in some way. And I think you'll be many of the folks in this call will probably be seeing an announcement after AOS about that working group and an invitation.
So Allison, though, in that case, which catalogs are you referring to? Are you thinking about the asset catalogs or data catalogs?
We're specifically looking at asset catalogs, so we're looking at things like the WMO Oscar catalog, for instance. JCOM Maps has an ocean catalog of assets. We've been developing a catalog for NSF funded assets and pulling in some international assets. The Alaska Ocean Observation System has been cataloging assets in the waters around the state of Alaska. There's probably a dozen catalogs I could mention, but we're not all exchanging information. And I don't think we've got a broad enough definition to include some of the community-based information as well in the way that we're doing it. And I think we need to step back, like as Ruth has said, and make sure that we're taking into account different perspectives beyond in situ instrumentation.
Thank you, Shannon.
It's referring to it as beyond the data set level. It's sort of an interim level of metadata, discovery level, very lightweight.
Thank you, Alison. Shannon has a question. Go ahead.
I just wanted Alison to repeat the name of that group for the notes, please.
Oh, sure. It is called the Polar Observing Assets Work Group.
And Shannon, that's the paper that Bill Manley will be presenting in another, in this session as well, or not this session, sorry, in this working group.
Great, thank you, Peter.
Hi, this is Jonathan. Sorry, I didn't raise my hand. Okay, so I have a question. Following on this discussion, I wonder where the repository fits in, because isn't the repository responsible for the catalog of the repository, and thereby the sharing of that catalog with the community? And then what happens when data become disassociated from their metadata? I think we're in a time where we have lots of storage. We have no limitations in the cloud, for example, and there's no reason to harvest a catalog without also harvesting the data that are associated, or at least getting at the data level and grabbing a piece of that for the whatever's being preserved or replicated across nodes of a network. And there's one more point is this brings up the issue I discussed before about where data are produced as part of a process or program. And then that's kind of a different question from how that data is going to be reanalyzed or reused for a secondary user. And I think that needs to be explicitly addressed in the catalog. For if no other reason, ownership of that data, the licensing is determined by whoever collected it. And just assuming we have open licensing, everything's open and accessible, there's still a fundamental need to give credit to and recognize the provenance of the data. So I think those are two issues that I didn't hear people raise. I just think we're at a point where we can't ignore that. We need to consider that as part of the solution.
Thank you. I think Pierre has a comment to make now.
Maybe I'll defer to Ruth. If this was an RDA topic, maybe you have a summary for us, and then maybe my comments are redundant.
Possibly. So I just wanted to let Jonathan know that this is exactly the conversation that was held at a RDA session from the RDA plenary that is also virtual and kind of conflicts with this meeting. And the upshot of that was that there are pros and cons to all of that, but everybody seemed to agree with you on the provenance issue. And the real question in concern is, how do you give repositories the credit for being the authoritative source for a data set when something like Figshare will come along and harvest all of your metadata and your data, and then they'll go off and people will access it through Figshare just because they know how to get data through Figshare, and maybe they have never heard of your repository. But then, you know, all the additional services that for example, domain-specific repository can provide, you know, are not being provided by Figshare. For example, creating and making sure the metadata is complete and those sorts of things. And so there are a whole host of issues around that. And I do believe that actually the upshot of that is going to be an interest group in RDA on this entire topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a number of technologies and approaches that need to be considered here. So what we're thinking on the UN Ocean Decade data strategy side is, again, the linked open data sort of movement, because again, if you have a fixed IRI or web accessible identifier for both a metadata and data record, you can link them to each other no matter where that fragment of information is. Many of you, of course, are in this game for a long time, so you know that. But I think it's the time now to bring it forward, because that's going to allow us to have that distributed system where, yeah, you can host to that cataloging information anywhere you want to, but the official IRI will always lead back to the trusted source, so in response to Ruth's points, which will have that sort of control, etc. And if it's not one of those IRIs, people will notice, or at least the data people will notice right away, that this looks like it's been rehosted. So I think folding in that logic to enable, as Matt said, that redundant distributed system to flourish, while making sure that the people who are real custodians of this stuff are able to do their job without interference, is a key sort of balance that we have to strike.
And that goes directly towards my comments about scienceonschema.org, where getting people to actually have real IRIs for a lot of the fields that one needs to have IRIs for seems to be challenging.
It's time, though. It's time we push, I think. Otherwise, it's just going to be more and more monolithic repositories that come and go, and the huge amounts of work to refactor one into another. And we can't afford that anymore. It's too big.
I agree.
Thank you for that. We have got a few more minutes. If Matt wants to ask a question or make a comment.
I just wanted to comment on the IRI space as sort of the solution to linking. It's really great. Linked data open movement, I think, has really helped connect things together, and clearly the web scale connectivity works well. But there is definitely a fragility problem with IRI space as well. And we all know that because IRI space is generally tied to domain names, that as the very same catalogs and projects that we were talking about having funding problems fail, their IRI space tends to fail as well. And so one of the things that we've been looking into is using content-based identifiers as potentially a solution to that, so that regardless of where something lives in that broader IRI space, it still has the same identifier and can ultimately be linked back to its metadata and all of the related sort of content that might be linked to it. And so I think there's some solution there, Pierre, that goes beyond just sort of the linked data approach and starts to think about immutable content and how replication really can point at content over the long term, regardless of domain name and other kinds of fragile changes in IRI space. Kind of getting a little technical there, but
yeah. So I hope. So this is exactly the issues that we're coming up with. In that, in a lot of cases, what organizations are willing to do, and what would make the data live for a long time, like forever, are mutually incompatible. Unless you can convince data managers and institution managers that their behavior needs to change if they want their data to guarantee the longevity of the data that they're responsible for.
Okay, with that, I think that's a good break point. Sandy Starkweather has joined us online, as I mentioned earlier, and she's going to tell us a little bit about the Say on Roads process that relates to, I think, a number of the topics that we're referring to here in terms of community connection, how we coordinate, and where we're going with respect to an integrated Arctic observing system. So Sandy, maybe if I can ask you to introduce yourself, and then you know how to do share screen.
I sure do. Hey, good middle of the night to everyone, or middle of the day, depending on where you are. I think I just stepped into that power techie conversation. That's probably the exact opposite of what I'm about to present. Peter, you said something like 10 minutes?
Yeah, it's pretty open, Sandy. We do want to get back to some of that power techie conversation, but I also think this is really critically important. It keeps coming up in terms of, as I said, how we connect and link people. So.
Right. Well, I'm sure everybody's heads are just going to be spinning with it while I'm talking anyway. So can I just do a quick raise of hands? And it's no problem, but just who saw the keynote already, so I don't recover too much ground that I started with there. Okay. So I see 2 raised hands. So I'm gonna then kind of take you through a little bit of the more background information, but say I address I'm not going to address the why we're doing this to a huge degree during the talk, and I'll focus more on the mechanics of the roads process. So my name is Sandy Starkweather. I'm a research scientist at the University of Colorado, but I'm funded by the NOAA's Arctic Research Program. I sit at the NOAA lab here in Boulder to lead, in particular, the U.S. interagency U.S. AON Arctic Observing Network effort, and so I think most people are familiar with the AON concept to a great enough degree, to the first order integrating what we already have, and to the second order working on the gaps process to get us to the network that we need through different kinds of structured methodologies is really what we've been focusing on. And then at the SAON level, I'm currently serving as the chair. Okay, so into share screen mode. Oops, I lost you. And Peter, thanks a lot for making space for this part of the discussion of the summit. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, it's not in presentation mode, but we do see it. Yeah, there it is.
I just hit that. Okay. Great. So yeah, as Peter said, I'm going to be presenting this roadmap for Arctic observing and data systems, what we're calling the roads process for SAON, which has really been integrated into this year's Arctic Observing Summit. Each working group is taking on some key tasking, or we're asking them to. SAON initiated the roads process last February. with a road mapping task force. The names on the left-hand side of the screen are those who contributed to the original drafting. We had a review period that lasted from August to October, where we heard from about a dozen people, and then integrated that into the white paper that was submitted to the summit. And what we really recognized is that to get the level of buy-in and understanding that we need for the roads process to be successful, that we really need the summit to directly interact with it and to critique it, vet it, improve it, and bring it to the next level of definition from where it's at right now. So things are in a pretty open kind of living document space is what I want to underline. If you look at the names as well, you can see that we were making an effort to engage with SAON's key partners in indigenous networks, the program managers, policymakers, people running large infrastructures, cyber infrastructures, physical infrastructures, et cetera, large projects, and more, global networks. So we tried to really do a cross section of who we consider SAON's key constituency. So as I said, these were the four questions I address in the keynote. What I'm really going to focus on here is number 2 and number 3. This is just sort of the summary of where we're going with the roads process. And what I would highlight as as 2 bullets in here. One is that the roads process is meant to be a sort of a light layer to help us address some of the systemic issues with network coordination across scales. And so I think you guys are all really well versed in this. The issues at the global scale are different, but related to the regional and local scale issues. And we're trying to create a bit of a systems engineering approach that could help us manage that complexity. And it's very much linked to SAON's mandate as reflected in its strategic plan, its decadal vision. So that was set forth in 2018, a strategic plan organized around 3 goals. The first, create a roadmap to a well-integrated Arctic observing system. And this is the goal that's really being taken up by our Committee on Networks. Promote free and ethically open access to all Arctic observational data, which is really your work, the work of the Arctic Data Committee, which puts the D into roads, which I think is really critical that we're looking at this process comprehensively. And 3, to assure sustainability of Arctic observing. And so really just think of our audience as being anyone who's really interested in guiding investments or strategies. So that's a big group. So that's what we're calling the roads process. So the roads process, kind of a foundational piece in the middle of this, was created before the process was even conceived of. And that was in 2017, the results of the workshop report you see on the left, where SAON, in partnership with the Science and Technology Policy Institute of the U.S. Office of Science and Technology Policy, came together and created the upper branches of what is called a value tree for assessing Arctic observing systems. And the tree is organized around 12 Arctic-specific societal benefit areas. So you'll see things in here that really reflect what we talk about in the Arctic, from food security to fundamental understanding, to sociocultural services, and then of course a lot of the things that you typically see in global societal benefit areas. But I think if you dug into the details of this report, you'd really see why it's important for us to develop an Arctic specific approach to looking at the key objectives for Arctic observing. So these 12 societal benefit areas are supported by 140 of these key objectives. And these objectives help us get a kind of finer tuned understanding of what we're trying to accomplish with the network. One thing that's really great about these assessment tools is they're very holistic. There's certainly many bases covered. And there's even, as you'll note, redundancy and interdependency across the societal benefit areas. They're by no means independent from one another. So it helps us kind of integrate that systems level view of what we're trying to accomplish, but also work on bite-sized pieces. And so this is going to come up later in the talk, but I just wanted to note this was already in place and we had it in mind when we were designing the roads process around this assessment strategy. So we started with principles and assumptions in order to kind of get everybody on the same page and make sure that we were hitting the right issues, those systemic issues, in the way that we really thought they needed to be met. So first and foremost, systemic issues at the local and Indigenous knowledge scale. The biggest deal is focusing on equitable participation and equitable partnership and active participation, ideally co-production. And this is the first principle in the list for a reason. It's a big challenge, and it's an important challenge. And so SAON really wanted to express its commitment to getting it right in the roads process. The second bullet, complement and integrate without duplication. And so this is really in reference to the realization that all of our partner networks and global initiatives have their own frameworks, their own road mapping processes. And what SAON is really seeking to do is to find a light layer, the meta layer, where we can integrate what these organizations are doing in a focused and effective way without overwriting what they're doing, allow them to plan the way they plan, and then come in and engage with us. And then last, and related to the previous notion, is that networks are at different stages in their development, and we wanted to have something that could be a stepwise and flexible process, so we're not trying to do everything at once, but hopefully starting with the imperatives. And so these principles and assumptions, I hope you see reflected in the layout of how we're planning to approach the road mapping process. So central to the road mapping process, as I said, is this idea of assessment, certainly, and value tree assessment using the societal benefit framework where possible. Again, we know some groups are going to think about their assessments a little bit differently, but I worked up this example of the food security benefit area from the framework to give you a flavor of what we're talking about. So in value tree analysis, the effort is to link through the value tree of information, as is well reflected in our data management infrastructure, that we're often passing products forward with various value added steps down what could be thought of as a delivery chain, though we don't want to think so linearly about this integration, but that's one way to think about it, that we rely on the applications layer, the user service layer, to translate observations into the key objectives supporting societal benefit. So those might be the assessments, surveys, they might be the key science questions, which aren't listed here, but certainly are valid in terms of kind of the application space. And so the challenge is often linking from the rudimentary observing system inputs and really understanding how this whole tree pieces together. So not everything feeds forward into everything. There's some parsing and loss as we move from the right-hand side of the diagram to the left-hand side of the diagram. But very often, and the mesh of connectivity in here, I think most of us know, these are often broken links where things are not making it from this intermediate product layer out to the application space. And very often it's because we don't have the interface we need to do that adequately. It is even named the Valley of Death in many operational agencies that are trying to move from rudimentary observations through products all the way up to applications. And so it's in this space that the global networks in particular have recognized that having some kind of a collaborative interface in the middle, which they often refer to as essential variables, can be a really advantageous way to break the problem down into broad phenomena. So they say variables, but they usually mean something more at the scale of a phenomena or a process in the case of Arctic systems, where you can do that kind of community of practice level work with subject matter experts who share areas of expertise to really get the data system requirements, the observing system, the societal requirements translated into observing system and data system requirements. And so this is a kind of key concept within the Rhodes process. It's going to help us, as I said earlier, link back to what the global networks are doing without overwriting it. Our intention in adopting an essential variable from a global network would be to extend the definition of its requirements and improve its implementation in the far north, rather than overwriting what they're doing, and similar thinking across other scales. So I'll jump into a couple examples. And just when you hear essential variables in the Rhodes process, think about these 3 steps. They're going to be identified based on some type of assessment, and we want the bar to be pretty high because we don't want a lengthy list of these. We want the most important short list of these. They're going to be defined by their requirements, again, bringing that community of practice together to help understand what scales we need to be observing at, what the latency requirements are going to be, what vantage points or key locations the observing system needs to be optimized in, using observing system experiments, what have you. That's the definition phase, and it's related to the observing and data system requirements. And then the 3rd phase is the implementation, where we say, and this is what you should use to do this. This is the best Arctic technology. So in that concept of extending the global networks, and I'll wrap up a little more quickly here, we recognize that the global networks are often looking at kind of global lens scale problems, and the requirements reflect that global lens, meaning larger spatial scales, certainly, longer latencies, and looking at things like climate issues, often longer time scales. And in adopting something like the sea ice essential variable, which is a global variable, as an Arctic essential variable, we begin focusing on those parts of the requirements that maybe support different types of societal benefit, the climate drivers. And then certainly thinking about a kind of C-bonds type strategy, where we're integrating across all the different aspects of the observing system that can support a certain kind of variable or observation. So, this is what this might look like for sea ice, extending it from the global networks, again, using different kinds of observations and different kinds of data systems to support things like coastal ice berm type in support of coastal protection, a different societal benefit. Another example from a funded project under Navigating the New Arctic in the US, looking at something like rain on snow events, drawing in, again, in this case, looking at what the local observer networks can contribute all the way up through what the satellites are going to contribute. What's interesting as you develop more of these, you'll see that passive microwave, for example, played an important role in sea ice. It also plays an important role in rain on snow events. Same with local observer networks. We begin to see those kind of key tools in the toolbox that are paying multiple dividends. It helps us give focus to data product development that's going to be most impactful, and observing system development that's going to be most impactful. So we're asking each working group to play a role in helping to better define and support the process. And I'll just jump to the specific for working group 4 is that we're really looking for input on how we organize this information and document it so that it can be accessible, transparent, shared, and help us to answer those strategic questions. The main thing to be documented would be the definitions of the essential variables and the assessments. So I think I'll leave it there because that's a good point for questions, and just take you back to this view of kind of more of a pictorial of how we see the working groups fitting together. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandra. Pierre has a comment or question for you.
Yes, thank you, Sandra. That was a really great overview. So I am on one of the panels for the essential ocean variables for biology and ecosystems, and it's really great to see that there's this high bar being set. I also work with data interoperability on the essential biodiversity variables, and if these hang out in an academic space too long, it doesn't go very far, and some very occult sort of principles start to come to the fore. So I think this is really nice to see. It's on the right track, and the coordination with existing variables is important. In this data interoperability session, with Goose, from the Goose perspective, and also the IOC UNESCO perspective, we do have the interoperability or semantic technology to represent the essential ocean variables, and we're offering the same to the essential biodiversity variables. We'd be happy to then extend that in coordination with the polar semantics working groups that are represented here and others to make sure that from source, as soon as you define them, we can integrate them into operational semantic systems, and then it'll be reused by data systems that are already up. So happy to support that, and really great to see. Could you perhaps list some of the obstacles? And then more of a question. When you're doing the selection process, this is always hard because everybody wants their favorite pet variable to come to the fore. How are you balancing this?
So that's a key question for the summit, and certainly one that Working Group 1 and Working Group 3, and I mean really all the working groups to a degree, we want them to weigh in on this, what the critical criteria should be in this assessment process. And so I'll kind of take you back to the principles and assumptions and the statement that we really want co-production to be integrated into this process. One of the things that we're hearing from the Indigenous Food Security Working Group 3, is they recognize that for capacity reasons, they really can't take on a wide world of variables. And so I think that through iteration with a group like that, that's going to help us find focus in particular on those variables that are going to be most impactful for Arctic in-region societal benefit, where I think we have the most to add to the global variables. And so I would say that that's going to be a really kind of valuable constraint on what's possible that will hopefully back its way into more focused criteria. The how of the SAON process is that we are going to have an advisory panel or of the roads process. We're going to impanel the roads advisory panel, and that's going to have representatives from, again, across this wide spectrum, and they interactively are going to help us. We collectively are going to try and keep that bar set pretty high, that something either is so highly impactful to Arctic societal benefit or so poorly defined in the, or so poorly implemented in the global system. One example being ocean heat content, well implemented globally because of the Argo network, poorly implemented in the Arctic because Argo doesn't work in the Arctic. So if there's some way we can generate that level of focus, but it's going to be the art of the process, is keeping that bar high.
Thank you, Sandra. Henrik Stein, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for the presentation. And maybe I should explain. I'm Henrik Stein Andersen. I'm from the European Environment Agency, where I'm responsible for the cross-cutting coordination of the Copernicus in situ component. And I can also tell you that we have produced a report on the requirements and data used by Copernicus in the Arctic, relevant for Arctic products and also for future satellites, because we realize that that some of the ideas concerning the evolution of the Copernicus space component will also require an upfront identification of requirements for satellite for in situ data for validation and calibration, for example, but also for the products. Anyway, the main thing is that we produce this report, and as part of the conclusions, we identify a clear need for better coordination in this region. And the only thing I would like to say to you is that the mandate, in a way, that we got from the services and from the space component is that we should try to work more closely with organizations like your own, like WMO and other. And I just want to say that we are more than willing to contribute, and maybe we need to discuss bilaterally exactly how and we actually can do that, how and when. But that's the only thing I want to say. I mean, we recognize CERN as an important, very important forum, and we would like to contribute in some way.
Thank you. And tell me your name again.
My name is Henrik Stein Andersen.
Okay, I see it in the, okay. So, and so I think the report you're referring to is one that Eric Buch passed along also to the Rhodes leadership, and it is a really valuable stream of information that we are going to bear in mind. The Working Group 5, one of the things they've been working on, and this might be a good thing for your group to look at as well, I don't know if I have it, oh, here we go, is that we've started creating this kind of engagement matrix for what might become topical foci for Rhodes expert panels. And I don't show this lightly because it can be a little too provocative in terms of how we're going to do this and how many expert panels we think we might have. We're not sure. We want it to be constrained again by the criteria for the variables, but we want to kind of be thinking about the lay of the land should, you know, something like or even invite these different groups to kind of think collectively, like, is the right terrestrial ecology variable on the list, not variables on the list, and might we need to, you know, promote that. But Copernicus, as you can see, it shows up in a couple of different places across this engagement matrix, and I think we have a lot to learn from what you guys have already done. Thanks for the question, Henrik.
No, it's correct. It's correct, Sandra, that that I'm talking about the report passed on to you by Eric. He actually was the lead also for this report, but it was produced as part of the activity that we have concerning coordination across the Copernicus for in situ component, the in situ activities. But I think also, I mean, as you probably know already, that that Copernicus is a number of things, and of course Copernicus, as let's say the individual services can contribute to your work. Some of the entrusted entities responsible for implementing the space component could also decide to do that on their own. But what we are trying to do at the EA is trying to coordinate across, and we would be more than willing to provide provide you with a contact point in case you need in case you need contact to Copernicus and such, and we will pass on any request from your side to the different or relevant services. But also as the European Environment Agency, we are willing to support and contribute the work. I mean, we really see a need for both coordination, but also cooperation.
Great, thank you so much. That's really helpful.
Thank you, Henrik Sten Andersen. We have a question from Darius.
Yes, hello, I'm from SciOS. I would like to mention that during last half a year, we make some work in with the Arctic variables. We have described the requirements for the, as we call it, SciOS core data. So our science optimization advisory group prepares some requirements, scientific requirements, data management requirements, and we have described SciOS core data for our whole community on Svalbard. And the report and all the regulation will be published on our webpage in April. And then we will start to mapping all that variables, all that core data with our partner databases and their data sets. So I think it could be important input to roads for sound.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad to hear we did not have somebody directly related to SciOS on the road mapping task force, but I'm glad to hear that we're not too far off from how SciOS is already orienting itself.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jonathan, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, Sandy, if you don't mind, could you show the list of working groups or topic areas? The one that
my extremely provocative chart that's not done yet.
Well, it's
oh,
yeah, it's good for conversation. I was wondering what the check marks mean.
Yeah, so I'm sorry I didn't advance all the way through. So I would put less investment in the check marks here right now. Again, Working Group 5 was helping to kind of flesh out this table, and one of the things we wanted to understand was how far along certain of these topical groups were in defining their own essential variables. So that we could understand if we had something to pick up and extend, or if the definition had to start from the ground up. And so I think that the most important thing in this chart right now is making sure that the engagement of the right organizations is reflected. So if you do see anybody missing, for sure. And as you can see with the local networks, we just haven't even really stepped in yet, but that's something we're hoping that Working Group 3 can help us with. But certainly, you know, let's use this as a discussion point if it'll help us kind of get more people on the list.
I wanted to address one area, the social science. Because that itself is multidisciplinary. There are several disciplines within it. Take, for example, economics versus anthropology, very different social sciences that don't fall well into the same category. I'm not suggesting to expand the list, but one thing we've been struggling with social indicators for the ocean in the U.S. As in speaking among interagency partners at the federal level, but there is the U.S. GCRP. That's the U.S. Global Change Research Program. I'm probably messing up that name. GCRP. Yeah, that's right. And several years ago, our National Academy of Sciences did a review of their assessment process for the national assessment. And brought up this point that the social components were not fully assessed. I think this was several years ago, maybe 2012. So since then, they've put a real effort into the social indicators for climate change. And so I recommend that you reach out to them. And it's too bad that at least for the US, the ocean observing system does not have a good set of essential variables for social sciences. And that's something I've been pushing for in the interagency framework. And if it can be motivated from the Arctic, that would be great. And we can bring it back to the national level, international level, what have you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. They're well received. I would love to learn more. And would someone like Julie Morris be the right person to start with at USGCRP for getting more input on that?
Sorry, I'm blanking on names, but I'll look at the person who presented this work. I can even just forward the email to you with
okay,
a presentation.
That would be great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan.
And hello, Henrik Stein. Do you have another question, or is it the same from before?
Sorry. No, I do not have another question.
Okay, thank you. If we move to Pierre.
Hi, me again. So regarding the societal benefit areas, so are they mapped in some way to the Sustainable Development Goals and their targets and indicators? I ask again from the data interoperability side. So I work with UN Environment on semantics for the Sustainable Development Goals so that they can be linked into data systems. And we also work with groups who have existing objective structures to, at a machine level, map them into the Sustainable Development Goals. So machines will understand how your societal benefit areas connect to the goals and what phenomena are relevant. We then can connect them to the essential variables, etc. Has any work on that been done? I assume so.
Yeah, so great question again. At the Arctic Observing Summit in Davos 2 years ago, the more kind of global scale working group spent a lot of time looking at both the Arctic societal benefit areas and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And you'll see in the text of ROADS that we do recognize that for some groups it may be more appropriate to use the SDGs than to use the Arctic societal benefit areas. And that's kind of getting back to that flexibility piece. But I think what you're proposing is even a greater step that has not yet been made, and it would be really valuable to make that step to do that crosswalk, so that for those people who do kind of sit in between and need to translate back and forth, they have an adequate tool to support that kind of analysis. I would just say broadly that, kind of getting back even to the last statement about social indicators, if there's a group that's really gone through that work already and done this with sustainable development goals, I think the SAN advisory panel would be very open to hearing about it. We are just seeking that it's a valid assessment methodology rather than sort of a homegrown assessment methodology.
Thank you for that. I think it can happen naturally, even maybe as a part of this EAV process, because when you identify the phenomena that are of interest and how it affects people, those overlap with some of the same phenomena that the indicators of the SDGs are pointed at. So it kind of like en passant, as they say, that you can map the two through the process. We did this with the CGIAR for agriculture and their objectives. So yeah, I think there is potential. Having that as a kind of thing in the back of your mind as you're developing the EAVs and others could make it much less painful down the line, certainly.
Yeah, thank you. No, it sounds like, Pierre, maybe you and I should have a more detailed follow-up call about this, because it sounds like you've got your hands on some of those really great non-duplicative resources that we were really hoping to harness in this process.
Sure, and we're looking for co-editors and co-leads on those because we give it away as much as possible so that people can run it, but it's interoperable at the end. So happy to further that.
Great, thank you. You're all making it feel well worth it to set my alarm for 3:30 in the morning.
Maybe this is just a dream.
Go ahead, Peter.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Sandy. We can continue with questions, but one comment I have with respect to your matrix that you're putting together for the social sciences is the International Arctic Social Science Association, or IASA, that Andrei Petrov is currently president of. So I know I've done work with them over the years. There may be some capacity issues in terms of engaging in something like this, but it's certainly one of the more active organizations along with the IASC Social and Human Working Group. So something maybe to consider there, reaching out.
Yeah, thanks. So Justina Dahl, who's on our SAON board from Sweden, she actually has kind of taken up the charge to help lead us into ICAS and into that IASA world. And she had submitted an abstract on roads to ICAS in Arkhangelsk, but you know, that meeting I'm sure is in the balance as everything else is right now. But so I hope Justina can help us with some of that engagement. She seems to have her head wrapped around both spaces pretty well.
Great. Yeah, she would be great. I would say, just as a note, yeah, that meeting has been deferred for a year, in my understanding, or delayed for a year. They've announced that. So a very practical thing, if I could ask when you're ready, if you could make your presentation available to us for our session record, that would be excellent.
Yep, I will email it to you right now.
And just while I'm on that, for Henrik Steen, sorry, if you could do the same if you're open to that idea. And then we'll hand it back and see if there are any other questions for you before we start wrapping up. Okay, well, not seeing any others, I'd like to thank you so much for setting your alarm for 3:30. I think this is great context, and I wanted to make sure that the folks in Working Group 4 and within our data community have a sense of what's happening with various initiatives, including certainly the roads process. One thing I would like to follow up on is tasking and roles and so on with respect to not only the Arctic Data Committee, which is part of SAON and the roads process, but also individual members, initiatives, and so on. So I think as we go forward, a number of people in this group would be interested, as you've seen, in connecting and following up.
Yep, super. And you know, Allison Gaylord I see on the line, and Bill Manley. We've also been doing some thinking about how their proposed task team really fits in nicely with a lot of the network discovery that we're going to need to do to support this process. So already some emerging connections, and thank everyone for that. And thanks for your time this morning.
Great. Well, we'll do a virtual applause here in our minds, at least. And I would like to now move on to wrapping us up. When I came in with the agenda, yeah. Sorry, was there somebody who wanted to make a comment? Okay, perhaps not. In our charge and the agenda that was set out for this session, we wanted to go back to some general discussion, and particularly on identifying, highlighting themes, issues, priorities, and so on from the perspective of the people on this call with respect to data management, interoperability, federated search, etc. So beyond what we've already talked about, we've already had some good discussions about the data discovery and all kinds of different facets of that. Semantics has come up, community building and so on. What are people thinking in terms of any priority areas or themes that we may want to be highlighting with respect to our statement and also discussion in additional or the future sessions of this working group?
Hey, Peter, I don't know if this would be too detailed, but it seems like there is a lot of interest in persistent identifiers. So whether those are content-based IDs or ROIs, that seems like a priority that we need to work out if we're going to be aggregating from multiple networks.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. And on top of that, a persistent identifier policy that we can pass on to others so that they can set up their own, but it's aligned somehow, as we discussed, Matt raised and as Allison raised too.
Great, that's excellent, and I think we can massage the language when we're writing to make sure it's accessible to non-experts, but I do think that's, again, foundational and quite critical. Do we have any other topics or themes that people would like to add to the discussion? One that I will put out there that I would like some commentary on comes from a meeting that we had, I guess, a week or so ago, maybe a couple of weeks ago now, with IARPC in the US. And we were, Sandy was on that meeting as well as Jonathan and some others. And the topic of what I referred to earlier as platforms or e-science, model-based science came up, and the importance of that in our space. So the ability to, have big data sitting on these platforms, having analytical tools sitting around that data, the whole saying of bring the code to the data, not the data to the code, and so on. And how quickly that's moving, how important it is, and where we need to be going with that as a community and how we recognize that. So is there anyone on the call who has either experience or opinions on that? And I'm thinking Matt Jones in particular. I know you're doing some work in that area, but where it's fitting into your overall strategy and where we should be prioritizing that in terms of its opportunities and also implications in moving into that model. Okay, I think we may have lost Matt. But... Okay. If you do have thoughts, let me know. I think Lil Alessa will be joining us at some point. She had a lot of thoughts on it, where we're going and so on. And I think she may be in a future session of this working group. But it's something that if you do have things that we want to consider, please let me know, because it is coming up in discussions, particularly from the science community, and in terms of how we think about these systems and also their relationship to other topics such as general interoperability and all of these foundational components. Okay, we are coming up on our time. I had indicated in the agenda that we don't necessarily need to go right to the time. Are there any other topics, any other general themes that people want to bring up, subjects, etc.?
A few in the chat. Mostly, I'd like to see something more about the care principles, in the sense, how do we actually react to that, and how do we work with local and indigenous groups on the data side, so that they don't get fatigued or we don't approach them in a, so Peter, you have loads of experience there. I think some of that guidance would be good. Also, in terms of, we all develop interoperation technology, but not all of it interoperates. So I think that's something that we need to solve before we can or at least have a good progress towards before we necessarily move out to the broader community. And then lastly, like as we said, the emphasis on getting those catalogs right, because that's going to be the backbone that we can discover each other's assets, resources, services, data sets, and then ask further questions and develop further interoperation. So those are the 3 points that I'd particularly like to see.
Great, thank you, Priya. That's excellent. And we often talked about, I think what you're referring to is what we call the human interoperability, which is the interoperation between the interoperation developers. Okay, and catalog services, I note that as well. With respect to the care principles, I think we have a really good opportunity here with Working Group 3. We have a lot of Indigenous participants, organizations, etc. My experience there points back to something that Sandra talked about in her presentation, which is the capacity, and what I mentioned in my intro about this level playing field is ensuring that the resources are there. One of the I think great things that has happened is that people, particularly in the research community, are recognizing the need to engage in ethical ways and to move to co-production. But I also see at the community level in particular, this has really inundated them with requests for partnership and, you know, people who want to engage and do it well, but there's limited capacity. You know, some of the communities I work in are 600 to 900 people. And so they might have 4 or 5, 7 people in the community who are working on these types of things. And if they suddenly have 10 or 12 or 15 organizations approaching them saying, let's work together, it's just not something that's very practical. So that's something that I wouldn't call it an elephant in the room, but it's something that certainly needs attention, is how do you take the care principles and these higher level things and actually operationalize them. And that'll definitely be of interest and part of the discussion, I think, of Working Group 3 and a good point of connection. So. Okay, any other points? Great. Well, we have a lot of background material here as well. Any of you who've been involved in the Polar Data Forum series or the Polar Data Planning Summit, etc. We have good information that we've collated and will synthesize here as well. But if you have any other thoughts, there are 3 additional sessions where we'll be focusing on dialogue. And particularly the next one, we wanted to get fairly deep into federated search and semantics. So if you're able to make that, and I don't have my schedule here, but that's in a few hours, that would be great if you could join session 2. And if there are no other comments, then I think we can draw session 1 to a close.
Hey, Peter, I just have a logistical question.
Sure.
How's the poster session working?
I have not been heavily involved in that, but basically if you go to the AOS link and the agenda link, there was some discussion a couple of days ago. They were still trying to nail down the number of posters and whether or not they'd be able to have as many concurrent sessions and so on. So that's not an area I can say a lot about, and that's just simply been a capacity thing on my side and inability to be working for 10 straight hours on it. But I'll take a look and I think try and post a message. I'm not sure the best way to communicate to this group, but if you do look at the agenda site, I think that's your best resource.
Yeah, the tracks.
Peter, can I?
Is there anything in for this track that you recommend we look at?
There were a couple. So Bill Manley has put one in. There's also one from Martin Takama, who I don't have the title with me, but is data related. And they should be tagged, as well as I know there's one for the Capartis program that Pierre and I are a part of. And so you can sort of go through depending on how it's landed over the last day or so in terms of where they'll be. There should be a tagging of data related posters. And I think Shannon, you wanted to chime in?
Yeah, Peter. So the poster session looks to start in about an hour following this. I believe the session that would be most pertinent to this group is rooms 1 and 2 for the Zoom session, observed science and data and information sharing. My understanding from working with Ravi is that they're going to do screenshots of their posters and people are going to get about 5 minutes to give an explanation of it. I'm not positive that's how it's going to go forward, but that was the discussion, if that's helpful.
Great, it is, Shannon, thank you. And I do know it was a moving space because originally I think we had over 100 posters submitted, but it wasn't clear how many of those would actually make it given the new format. So just, yeah, click on the poster link and it is, yeah, 12 o'clock to 1400 GMT today. And you'll see the latest, greatest rooms, titles, and presenters.
For other people in the conversation, it looks like Gabrielle Vance has posted some information about it in the chat as well.
Great, and I'll just quickly screen share here for those of you not familiar. So it's at AOS2020agenda.org, and then there's a posters tab there.
Oh, I was close. It's 1 to 2 minute summary, I guess. They had so many, they had to cut it down.
Okay, great. Okay, in the few minutes we have remaining, does anyone else want to add any additional comments or are there additional questions?
Hi, Peter, could you give us an idea of the content that'll be covered in the next couple of working group 4 sessions? I'm just trying to strategize when I should take a nap.
Yeah, I think the next session in particular is one that would be great if you could attend. That is the one that we're looking at. Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm just looking at that. We want to talk about the federated search and semantics. So I think that would be really central to the type of work that you're doing. And anybody else on the call, really the sessions will be quite dependent on participation. So I can certainly provide overview and all of that on what's been happening, but if we want to get some work done, we need folks who are interested and have some background to join. So that would be, I think, one that would be important for you to attend, if at all possible. And then that's, I think, if I'm correct, the last one for today for this. And then just going through the agenda here. And then the next one will be tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And that one said you might have a little bit of chance for a rest. We're looking at, again, more community building there. And then the following is for the data platforms, et cetera. And so I need to check in with Lil and some others who have some interest there to see how much traction we can get with that one.
Okay, great, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all for this, for joining us. I'm really pleased with the turnout, and I'm pleased that we were able to bring people together. And I want to thank all of the people who have been working really, really hard to turn this from an in-person meeting into a virtual meeting. It's been a huge amount of effort from a lot of people. And so I think I just want to say thank you for that. And we'll do our best to keep the conversation going and to get something tangible out of this this process. So I encourage you as much as possible to join us when you can. And I'm just seeing there's some room meeting, et cetera, in the chat window if you want to take a look.
Is there a point where we can have like beer together, like remotely? Is there a Zoom beer mission?
There should be. We actually talked about this, and to be honest, I'm not sure because we don't. This was never, AOS is never meant to be sort of a conference, so it's typically working groups and usually in-person working groups. But we should think about that for the future sessions. So if people want to bring a refreshment and also just have some really informal chat, we have lots of room for that.
Yeah, breakfast martinis, I guess, count. So no problem.
I wish. Thanks, Pierre. Okay, thanks all. And I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Peter.
Okay.
Thank you and goodbye.